Mixing with Mike, plugin of the week is the Slate Digital FGX. The FGX plugin is a mastering plugin suite, and it's actually pretty straightforward. It's not a lot of bells and whistles. You don't have all kinds of layers of racks and in piling on layers of processing and stuff like that. It's really straightforward. What you get with it is a compressor, high quality mastering level compressor, which is a combination, as described by Slate in the manual, is a kind of opto slash VCA style compressor. So probably taking on some of the aspects of the SSL bus compressor and perhaps LA2A, that type of thing on the optical side. And then there's a level processor, and this is more of your maximizer plugin, where what you're dealing with is the control of transients, and there's some intelligent settings in here. So when we look at an overview of the plugin, we have as a preset menu here. There's loads of little settings and options here, so it's worth kind of opening up. These are for dealing with presets and banks and all of that sort of stuff. And this is where you can kind of save and load presets and all of those sorts of things and step through them. There's also a setting up here in the top right, and this gets to do with some of the basic settings for hold on the value display, whether the mouse wheel sensitivity is fine, medium, coarse, etc., etc., etc. And it also gives you access to the user manual. You have all the standard settings here, but there's also a settings menu that works within the compressor plugin, and this has to do with the basic threshold settings, right? So in other words, what is the max value on the threshold setting? You can make it plus 10. If this isn't giving you enough headroom. So some things like that, the threshold range, what is the range, 10, 20, 30, etc. Ratio range, so you can go to heavier ratios if you want, or kind of keep it light. And this gives you more focused individual control. So there are some basic settings. You can link the attack and release settings if you like. So there's some aspects like that. You could have the meter settings showing gain reduction and all that sort of stuff. So there's loads of different settings that you can kind of get into if you're really into that type of stuff. And then on the FG level, then there are also settings here which just kind of get to the level range. For this guy, there's other ceiling settings here, which is the dither, right? So you can set your dithering on this and also set the peak output level, and we'll kind of get back to that in a second. And then we have settings for the meter. So there's just loads and loads of settings. You actually have 3 separate meter settings, and you can set up the individual parameters for them. So for example, let's just kind of cancel out of this for a second. I can have a scale here that goes from -30, but then I can also make a scale that gives me, more resolution if I'm looking to my overall peak levels. And so I can kind of set those parameters to give me 3 different metering displays, which is also kind of cool. And then there's also some settings in here in terms of the reference RMS level. So this is sort of a target RMS level, and we'll get into a little bit of this as well. So and then you get some ballistics in terms of the release and hold and all of those sorts of things. So plenty of options and settings that you can kind of dig into and figure out what you want to do. So I'll start by taking a look at the compressor. Now, I can actually take you could take any of these elements out of the circuitry here by hitting the power switch. So that kind of becomes your in, out, or bypass setting when you're dealing with, the basic setup here. Otherwise the bypass will go as a bypass for the whole plugin. Now this is actually placed on a full mix right on the end of the chain. And in this particular mix, there already is a mix bus compressor, a Fairchild compressor, and a tape that also happens to be a Slate tape. So this actually ends up, being the post of that. So you may have different feelings. You kind of have to listen to the mix and kind of decide what type of approach you would have. But I want to kind of show a couple of things here. So we have our normal attack and release setting here, a ratio setting, and a threshold setting. So pretty straightforward, no big surprises or crazy stuff. We have our gain reduction meter, which can also show input and output. And you can also do the settings to show the range of levels and all that sort of stuff. So let's start. Now there's a couple approaches here. One is where we can kind of slow down our attack here and pick up the pace of the release, and this would give us kind of a pumping and breathing kind of compression. So if I do this with a sort of kind of moderate ratio here. All right, so let me just get to where there's some drums. So this will kind of trigger our gain reduction. Now, there's kind of one interesting thing here in working with this, and you'll notice that there's no makeup gain. Now, there is a very cool feature here, which I'm going to get into, but I'm going to leave it off for a second, is this constant monitoring gain. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this as my makeup gain. Now, because it's so low, and so the general input levels coming in, as you'll see down here, are not high enough to trigger any limiting as we kind of bring the gain up. This will become our makeup gain here. So when I take this in and out, you'll be able to hear, I'll bypass from over here, and this will kind of make it a little bit easier to kind of A/B. So that actually has kind of a cool vibe. It gives it like a subtle pump. You notice that there's not a lot going on here in terms of the gain reduction, but it's really more about the movement. And it's, so from that aspect, it's really cool. In that subtle pumping and breathing movement, if the mix is pretty well together, this is just kind of giving a little bit of an extra character to it. Another approach to this might be to do something where we go to a fast attack and more of a slow release. Let me just see. Okay, all right, so I'm just getting my ballistic set here. It's dragging up and down. If I'm using universal audio, I have it kind of going radially, so it can kind of work kind of both ways here. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to go a little bit more to kind of a peak limiter type of thing with a fast attack and a long release, and kind of set this to be a little bit more subtle and smoothing. So if we just kind of do a quick A/B, one is sort of a subtle pump and breathe. This is sort of a more smoothing overall pull the mix together type of thing. And the B setting should be our pump and breathe. So you can hear the warmth that's brought out with this.
Take a moment and breathe. I can hear what you're saying. Stop for a minute. Come sit there with me. I can see you're afraid, and I don't know what to tell you. You're scared I might fail you, and so you're leaving here before it goes wrong. Don't you know you can't keep running from where you belong?
So, there's something that has both. This is kind of giving it a little bit more warmth and a little bit more solidity. The other is kind of opening it up a little bit, so you could kind of decide either way what you like. So, one other approach that is somewhat similar to this, so maybe we'll kind of compare the two of them here, is to go with a very, very light threshold, but a very low ratio. Very low threshold and a very light ratio. And so what we'll do here is just kind of work in sort of like some medium attack fast or medium fast kind of attack and release times. And what this does with the very low threshold is just kind of pulls together or tightens an overall mix. So if you feel like maybe the blends in the mix could be just like a little bit more pulled together, this is kind of a unique approach that is helpful for that. And so with that low threshold, you're in a constant state of compression or limiting. But it's sort of, because the threshold is so low, you're not dealing with sort of peak limiting. You're dealing with sort of a more of an RMS style compression, where it's kind of pulling from a much lower level and kind of cranking your mix together. The makeup gain is kind of pulling some of the low level stuff up a little bit higher, and then you're kind of crunching like the top 30 dB of your mix a little bit and kind of tightening it. So it's a way of like kind of pulling the overall mix together. And I can even bring this threshold lower if I go into the settings and sort of make that. Oh, actually, that's the limit on the threshold range, so I can't go any farther than that. So I take that back. So that's another approach. Let's kind of compare that to the other limiter approach. So I kind of like the fast attack, longer release setting here than this. So it's so much like, just from this basic setup, you can kind of go through a number of different ideas and approaches and kind of see what does this. I like the kind of warmth that this brings in. So let's go right into the FG level. Now the FG level has some really cool features, and I think one of the coolest features is the constant gain monitoring. And what that does is it's like a very much a mastering centric kind of process, whereby when you're applying limiting to figure out the sound and sort it out, what happens is that when you bypass the plugin, that your gain drops maybe 10 dB because you may be bringing up that much gain. The idea here with the gain is that as I bring up the gain, it's kind of pushing into the limiter, and then I can set my output ceiling here. So if I set my output ceiling at 0.1, I may go to like 0.2 or something, depending upon if I want to give a little bit more headroom on the top end, so it's not clipping sort of cheaper components and things like that. And sometimes actually that's also better when you're creating MP3 files and things like that. Actually, if you get too close to the top, you'll find that the MP3 processing will create distortions and clipping there as it starts to extract information it thinks isn't important. So you have to kind of be careful about that. We'll leave that kind of as it is, but the constant monitoring will allow us to listen at the incoming level, but meter the total gain. So you'll kind of see as I crank up this gain, we're going to hear eventually distortion, but the overall level is not going to come up. And you'll see the metering kind of go up here, right? So it should peak out at 0.1, right? So as I crank more, right? I could get some pretty heavy duty overloads in there. So that's obviously what I'm trying to avoid. Now, one of the settings that you'll notice here, which was the nope, that wasn't that one. I thought it was that one. Maybe it's, oh, I'm sorry, it's the meter setting here, which is the RMS level. This is sort of a trigger point, the -10, and this gets to like the where you want your RMS level in mastering. Without turning this into a mastering kind of workshop or course, the idea here is that where do you want the RMS level in relation to the peak level? And generally, this is sort of a crossroad where you start to get into, heavier limiting, where your mix sounds pretty compressed. So if you're in that -10 range, you're usually in a pretty good area. As you start to go up towards -8 and -6, depending upon the frequency content and many other things, you're getting into really, really heavy limiting. So that difference between the peak level and the RMS level is what's called a crest factor. And so that crest factor range, if it's somewhere in that -10, to -8 or -12 to -8, you're usually, you're not in a bad area. As you start to creep up though, towards -8 and -6, then you're getting into pretty heavy limiting. There are some downsides to that, and you have to investigate that more because streaming services are now sort of setting standard levels where they're basically setting the average level to a default value of -20. And if that's the case, then you're basically cutting off all your peaks and losing a lot of headroom that you would normally have. I'm not sure if -20 is that number, but you want to kind of follow that and monitor that if you're mastering and kind of working on things. So let's just see how far I can kind of push this here. So now when this is actually hitting plus, right, 1 here, or -1, now I'm getting into peak limiting. That's where I'm getting into distortion. So I'm going to kind of leave this into like like somewhere in here where I feel pretty comfortable and just kind of show a couple of other features. Now, one of the features that they have here is a thing they call ITP, which is Intelligent Transient Preservation. And the idea here is, I haven't turned on the dithering yet, but the idea is like how aggressive the peak limiter is attacking. So it's sort of like a knee control, where it's like a hard knee, soft knee kind of thing. And so for something like this, a little more R&B, we kind of probably want to be smoother. But I want to show you a couple of the features here, which are really cool. One is dynamic perception. Now, it's hard to understand what the description of this is in terms of the way that they talk about it. To me, it sounds like low-level compression, where you're kind of bringing up presence energy from underneath and mixing it in. So I kind of want to show you what that's like. And I can start to hear some clipping in the background here.
Yeah. Slow down, baby. Take a moment and breathe. I can hear what you're saying. Stop for a minute. Come sit there with me.
And what it's doing is it's bringing out some detail, which is kind of cool. Now, there's also a feature here called detail. This deals with the transient processing that works with lower frequencies and higher frequencies. So if I want the low end to kind of push or pump a little bit more, or be a little bit more dynamically responsive, and the same with the high frequencies.
Stop for a minute, come sit there with me. I can see you're afraid, and I don't know what to tell
let's do an A-B here. So that's with this in. Without. So even now I can go to a little less gain reduction. And now if I want to smooth this off, I can kind of pull it back here. Or make it punchier. So here, this is kind of is really helpful. This is like a very important parameter because as you can do this, you can determine sort of the punchiness. And of course, it's always relative to the original. I think for this type of track, if it was a bit punchy or a little bit cold on the cold side, it would be pulling back and smoothing it out. If it felt like it was too warm and needed a little bit more push, then going a little bit more towards the hard would kind of give it a little bit more of an aggressive character. But here we can get like a really good, preserving enough of the dynamic and kind of bring in or balance in some of the other frequency areas and control the transient energy in terms of how responsive it is and where it's responding. Very, very cool, overall in terms of the layout and when you kind of get used to the functionality of it, which doesn't take long. It actually is pretty intuitive overall if you kind of understand what you're going for, or particularly if you've done other mastering. And then of course the dithering here, this is more to the type of thing where if you're going to bounce this out to a 16-bit mix, then you want to do it here. You could also set your output ceiling so that if you're printing MP3s from the mix, create a 24-bit mix, set this to 0.2 or 0.3 on the minus side. Give yourself a little bit more headroom and you'll find that the MP3s actually burn cleaner and sound better than if you burn them from the 16-bit and 0.1. So there are some things to consider there when you're actually working with this and actually creating a series of masters that are specific to burning the MP3s where they come through clean and undistorted. So kind of think about those types of things. Do a little bit of research on that. But I really dig this plugin. It's a good one. It's pretty straightforward and simple. Not too many bells and whistles. You're not getting like 85 plugins to throw in there. Just really straightforward. Something you could throw on your mix bus, just the way I've done here on the mix. So if you're sending this off to a client, you want to kind of give them a mastering touch. You could store your presets, kind of come up with your settings, and send them off something that is level balanced. The constant gain monitoring, this is just what you're listening to, not what's actually outputting. So when you output it, obviously you want to take it off and monitor that way and make sure there's nothing else going on. But this is really cool because it gives you the ability when you're A-Bing in and out to be at the relatively the same level so that you can actually hear what it's doing because, as you all know, louder always seems to sound better for a lot of obvious reasons. All right, that's a wrap on this one, the Slate Digital FGX. They're by Fabrice Gabriel. Very, very good one. And, for mastering, simple, straightforward, to the point, and sounds great. there you have it.